The sound of the axe biting into the pine log was the only prayer Marcus Stone had left. A sharp, clean thwack that split the evening air, a temporary relief from the silence that had taken root in his soul. Each swing was a punctuation mark in the long run-on sentence of his loneliness. He worked until his muscles burned and his breath sawed in his chest, trying to outrun the memory that always found him at dusk. The sight of Eliza Hayden's empty side of the church, the rustle of 100 confused guests, the heat of humiliation crawling up his neck. He'd built walls around his heart since that day, brick by bitter brick. The sprawling Texas ranch stretching before him was both his kingdom and his cage. At 38, he was a man carved from the very land he tended, weathered, unyielding, his spirit as parched as the summer-scorched earth. His friends, like his best friend Jake Morrison, had tried to breach his defenses with six-packs and forced fishing trips. But Marcus had perfected the art of being present while remaining utterly absent. Have you ever built a fortress around your heart, only to find you've locked yourself in a prison of your own making? The world moved on without him. He watched from a distance as seasons turned, as neighbors married and had children, as life was lived just beyond the fence line of his property. He convinced himself he didn't need any of it. Needing no one was the ultimate armor. Needing no one meant never being blindsided again. But then autumn arrived, painting the live oaks in shades of fire, and with it came a crack in his foundation. It was a Tuesday. The sky was a hard, cloudless blue. The sound was wrong first. Not the familiar rumble of Jake's truck, but a choked sputter and the groan of dying machinery. A dust-covered sedan sat at the end of his long driveway, a metallic intruder in his ordered world. Marcus approached with the cautious gait of a man expecting a threat. His first instinct was to call a tow truck and retreat back into his house. But then the car door opened. Her name was Safia Bennett. She emerged, a silhouette against the vast Texas sky, her dark hair a wild frame for a face that was all sharp, intelligent angles and soft, worried eyes. She wasn't just beautiful, she was a disturbance, a question mark where he had only periods. "I am so sorry," she said, her voice a low, steady alto that didn't match the frustration in her eyes. It just gave up. She gestured to the car as if it were a misbehaving pet. Marcus crossed his arms, his standard defensive posture. He offered a grunt, a non-committal sound. Safia explained she was trying to get to Cedar Creek for a job interview at the veterinary clinic. Her phone was a useless brick. She was stranded. Every instinct in him screamed to give her the number for Pete's towing and walk away. But something in the determined set of her jaw, the way she stood her ground without being confrontative, made the words stick in his throat. "I'm headed that way," he heard himself say. The lie was so smooth it surprised even him. He wasn't headed anywhere. The drive into town was a 15-minute exercise in awkwardness. The cab of his truck smelled of old leather, dust, and now subtly, of her, hints of sage and clean soap. She filled the silence with small, observant comments about the landscape, the stubborn beauty of the mesquite trees, the way the light hit the distant hills. He answered in monosyllables. "Yep." "Nope." "Suppose?" But Safia was a gentle, persistent force. She didn't pry, she observed. "You take care of all this land yourself?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over the endless acres. "Mostly. It's proud land. Doesn't give itself away easily." The insight was so unexpected it punctured his reserve. He glanced at her. "No, it doesn't." He learned she was a veterinarian from Dallas, that the city's constant noise and relentless pace had worn her down to a nub. She spoke of concrete and traffic lights with a kind of gentle despair, a longing for something authentic. He dropped her at a small office on Main Street, the one with the Cedar Creek Animal Clinic sign freshly painted. He drove away, the ghost of her scent still in his truck, the echo of her voice in the new silence. He told himself that was that, an anomaly, a blip. Life would return to its gray, predictable rhythm. It did not. A week later, his foreman pointed out a heifer with a limp. Reluctantly, Marcus called the clinic, and of course, Dr. Bennett was the one sent out. She arrived in a clinic truck, all professional efficiency. She handled the animal with a calm, confident grace that was mesmerizing to watch. She diagnosed a minor hoof abscess, treated it, and gave clear, concise instructions. Afterward, standing by her truck, she smiled at him. A real unguarded smile that reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. "How's the car?" he asked, for lack of anything else to say. "Alive and well, thanks to Pete's towing, and thank you again for the rescue." He nodded, his hands shoved in his pockets. "No problem." She didn't leave. She just stood there, looking out at his land. "It's even more beautiful when you're not stranded beside it," she said softly. And so, the pattern began. Her visits became a regular occurrence, a horse with a cough, a follow-up on the heifer. Each time, she'd stay a little longer. He'd find himself offering her a glass of iced tea. Then, one afternoon, he found himself showing her the old barn, where his grandfather's branding irons hung on the wall like relics from a forgotten war. He found himself talking, telling her about the drought of '99, about the time a blizzard nearly wiped out the herd, stories of the land that were, in truth, stories of himself. She listened, her head tilted, her full attention on him like a gift. She didn't offer empty sympathy or try to fix anything. She just witnessed him. And Marcus, for the first time in years, felt seen. The thaw was terrifying. He'd wake up in a cold sweat, Eliza's phantom laughter in his ears. He'd be short with Safia the next day, retreating behind his wall, his words turning clipped and cold. He was testing her, pushing, waiting for her to sigh in exasperation and leave, thus proving his entire worldview correct. But Safia didn't leave. She'd simply accept his retreat, give him space, and return the following week with the same steady warmth, as if resetting the clock. Her consistency was a quiet rebellion against his cynicism. One evening, she found him on the porch, staring into the darkness, a storm of old memories brewing behind his eyes. He'd been particularly distant all day. "You don't have to tell me," she said, leaning against the porch rail. "But you look like a man fighting a war with a ghost." The observation was so accurate it stole his breath. The words tumbled out of him then, haltingly at first, then in a torrent. He told her about Eliza, the wedding plans, the suit, the empty church, the way his future had evaporated in a single sun-drenched afternoon. He told her about the pitying looks in town, the shame that had festered into this hard protective shell. Safia listened until he was spent, until the only sound was the crickets and the ragged edge of his own breathing. She was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "She didn't just break your heart, Marcus. She made you doubt you ever had one worth offering. That's the real crime." It was the truest thing anyone had ever said to him. The walls, he realized, weren't just to keep pain out. They were to hide what he believed was his own broken, worthless core. Winter's first chill was in the air the night he almost kissed her. They were standing by her truck, the moon a sliver of ice in the black sky. The moment hung between them, fragile and electric. He could see the question in her eyes, the willingness, and the fear. His old, familiar enemy clamped down on his throat. He took a step back. The hurt in her eyes was a physical blow. She just nodded, a small, tight movement. "Good night, Marcus," she whispered, and got in her truck. He stood there long after the red taillights had vanished, the cold seeping into his bones. He had gotten what he wanted. He had pushed her away. He was safe. So why did it feel like he had just handed his heart back to the ghost that broke it? Why did the silence of the ranch now feel like a verdict? He was safe, and he had never been more miserable. The silence after Safia left was a living thing. It wasn't the familiar, hollow quiet he had cultivated for years. This was a sharp, accusing silence, filled with the echo of her truck engine and the ghost of what he had almost done. The cold air on the porch felt different now. Not just an absence of warmth, but an active chill that seeped into the very bones of the house. For 3 days, Marcus didn't leave the ranch. He threw himself into the most punishing labor he could find, mending a fence line that didn't need it, cleaning out stalls that were already clean. He worked until his body screamed for rest, hoping exhaustion would silence the new, treacherous voice in his head, the one that whispered he had been a coward. Jake Morrison showed up on the fourth day, letting himself into the kitchen without knocking. He took one look at Marcus, who was staring into a cold cup of coffee, and sighed. Heard Doc Bennett was out here the other night. Marcus grunted, not looking up. Also heard you're out here treating your fence posts like they personally offended you. Jake poured himself a coffee and sat down, the chair scraping loudly. You want to tell me what you did? Didn't do anything, Marcus muttered. That's the problem. Jake was quiet for a moment, a rare occurrence. You know, for a smart man, you can be the dumbest son of a gun I've ever met. That woman looks at you like you hung the moon, and you're doing everything in your power to prove her wrong. The words hit their mark. It's not that simple, Jake. It never is. But it ain't that complicated either. You're scared. I get it. But you letting one woman's mistake dictate the rest of your life? That's not strength, Marcus. That's surrender. The truth of it was a gut punch. He had spent years thinking his isolation was a fortress. Now, he was starting to see it was a tomb. Have you ever been given a chance at a different life, only to find your own hands are the ones pushing it away? The following Monday, he had a legitimate reason to go into town for supplies. He told himself he wouldn't go by the clinic. He wouldn't look for her. But his truck, as if with a will of its own, turned down Main Street and slowed to a crawl as he passed a small white building. And there she was. Through the window, he saw her kneeling, comforting a nervous-looking terrier. Her back was to him, but he could see the gentle curve of her shoulders, the calm patience in her posture. She was everything real and good in the world, and he had pushed her away. He was about to drive on, to retreat back into the familiar safety of his regret, when she stood and turned. Her eyes met his through the glass. There was no anger there, no resentment, just a quiet, profound sadness that struck him harder than any slap. She didn't smile. She simply held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow, slight nod before turning back to her work. That nod undid him. It wasn't an invitation. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the chasm between them, one that he had dug with his own two hands. In that moment, the fear of losing her became far more terrifying than the fear of being hurt. He didn't go in. He wasn't ready for that, but he drove home with a new resolve settling in his chest, cold and hard as stone. He had to try. He had to prove to both of them that the man she saw wasn't a complete illusion. The opportunity came sooner than he expected. A late-season blizzard, rare for this part of Texas, swept down from the panhandle without warning. The weathermen called it a once-in-a-decade event. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to howl, carrying with it the first stinging flakes of snow. Marcus spent the day securing the ranch, moving the cattle to the most sheltered pasture, ensuring the generators were fueled. As the storm intensified, his thoughts drifted to Safia. She lived in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, old and not well insulated. The power would likely go out. She'd be cold, alone. The old fear whispered that it wasn't his problem, that she could take care of herself. But the new, fragile voice of responsibility shouted it down. This wasn't about romance. It was about basic human decency. He loaded his truck with extra firewood, blankets, and a thermos of hot soup his part-time housekeeper had left. He told himself he would just check on her, make sure she was safe. Then he would leave. The drive into town was a white-knuckle nightmare. The wind whipped the snow into a blinding horizontal sheet. The truck slid on the icy ruts of the road. It took him over an hour to navigate a journey that usually took 20 minutes. Her cottage was dark, a single beacon in the swirling whiteness. He knocked on the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. When she opened it, she was wrapped in a thick blanket, her face pale in the gloom. The surprise in her eyes was quickly replaced by a wary caution. "Marcus, what are you doing out in this?" "The generator," he said, the lie coming easier this time. "I was in town getting parts, saw the power was out on this side, wanted to make sure you had wood." He gestured to the stack in his truck. She hesitated, and for a terrible second, he thought she would send him away. Then she stepped back, pulling the blanket tighter. "Come in. You must be frozen." The inside of the cottage was cold, but he could see she had a small fire struggling in the hearth. He got to work without another word, bringing in armloads of dry wood, stoking the fire until it roared with life, filling the small space with a dancing orange glow. He checked the pipes for freezing, found an old kerosene heater in her shed, and got it running. He moved with a quiet efficiency, not speaking, just doing. It was a language he understood. Action, not words. When he was finished, the cottage was warming up. He turned to leave. You should be all right now. The fire will hold. I'll come check when the storm breaks. Marcus? Her voice stopped him at the door. Thank you. He just nodded, unable to meet her eyes. It wasn't just about the generator, was it? She asked softly. He froze, his hand on the doorknob. He could feel the weight of the moment, the precipice he was standing on. He could retreat, and this time he knew she would not wait. Or he could step forward into the terrifying unknown. He turned around slowly. The firelight played across her face, highlighting the gentle strength he had come to. What? Admire? Need? No, he said, his voice rough. It wasn't. He took a step towards her, then another, closing the distance he had created. I was wrong, Sophia. What I did, pushing you away, it was the act of a coward. I was so afraid of history repeating itself that I tried to stop time altogether. She watched him, her expression unreadable. I can't fight a ghost, Marcus. I won't. You don't have to. She's gone. I'm the one who kept her here. He took a deep, shuddering breath. It felt like the first real breath he'd taken in years. I am terrified, but I am more terrified of watching you drive away for the last time. He reached out, his calloused, work-roughened hand hovering near her face. A question, a plea. For a heart-stopping moment, she didn't move. Then she leaned her cheek into his palm. It was the barest of touches, but it sent a current through him so powerful it felt like a jolt of lightning. The dam inside him broke. He didn't kiss her, not then. Instead, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, burying his face in her hair. He just held her as the storm raged outside, as the fire crackled inside. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that had been spinning out of control for years. And she held him back, her arms wrapping around his waist, her grip just as strong. They stood like that for a long time, not speaking. No words were needed. The long, frozen winter within him was finally, truly beginning to thaw. He stayed that night, not in her bed, but on her couch, stoking the fire, keeping watch. It was a vigil, a promise. When he drifted off near dawn, the storm had passed, and the first rays of the morning sun were turning the world outside into a glittering, pristine diamond. When he woke, she was sitting in a chair opposite him, watching him, a soft smile on her face. The power's back on, she said. He sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. I should get back to the ranch, check on the herd. She nodded. I have a full day at the clinic. There will be animals that need help after that storm. They were back to practicalities, but everything was different. The space between them was no longer a void, it was a bridge. He helped her dig her car out before he left. As he was about to get into his truck, she came up to him. She stood on her toes and pressed a soft, firm kiss to his cheek. Be careful driving home, she whispered. The simple gesture felt more intimate than any kiss he could remember. He drove home with the ghost of her touch on his skin, and for the first time, the memory of Eliza was completely silent. What happens when you stop running from your fear and finally turn to face it? You find it was never a monster, just a shadow. And shadows cannot exist in the light. The weeks that followed were a delicate, beautiful negotiation. They took things slowly. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping romantic gestures. Their relationship was built in the small, quiet moments. A shared meal after a long day. Her reading a book in his living room while he did the accounts. Him showing up at the clinic to drive her home when she worked late. He learned the landscape of her, the way she hummed when she was concentrating, the specific way she tied her hair up when she was working, the fact that she was fiercely, stubbornly independent, but had learned the grace of allowing someone to help her. And he, in turn, began to let her see the landscape of him. Not just a strong, silent rancher, but the man who worried about his aging livestock, who felt the weight of his family's legacy, who secretly loved old poetry but was too embarrassed to admit it. He brought her a book of Robert Frost poems one day, leaving it on her kitchen table without a word. She found it and didn't say anything, and just squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. It was the most vulnerable gift he had ever given anyone. The change in him did not go unnoticed. Jake clapped him on the back so hard he almost stumbled. "About damn time," was all he said. People in town stopped giving him pitying looks and started giving him genuine smiles. But the past never fully relinquishes its grip. It waits in the wings, patient as stone. It was a bright, clear Saturday afternoon when it reappeared. They were in town picking up feed. Marcus was loading bags into his truck when a voice, smooth as oil and twice as slick, cut through the air. "Well, I'll be Marcus Stone. I heard you'd become a hermit." Marcus froze, his back stiffening. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Eliza Hayden, or rather, Eliza Crawford now. He turned slowly. She was there, standing by a shiny new SUV. She was still beautiful, but it was a polished, brittle beauty, all designer sunglasses and perfect highlights. She looked out of place, a hothouse flower in a field of hardy native plants. Her eyes flickered over him, then past him, to where Safia was approaching with 2 cups of coffee from the diner. A calculating look passed over her face. "Marcus?" Safia said, coming to stand beside him. She handed him a coffee, her gaze shifting from his tense face to the stranger. "Eliza," Marcus said, his voice flat. "This is Safia Bennett." "Ah," Eliza said, a knowing, condescending smile playing on her lips. "The new girl? I heard there was someone trying to fill the vacancy." She looked Safia up and down, a dismissive once-over. "Well, good luck. He's a lot of work." The insult was veiled, but its intent was clear. She was marking her territory, a territory she had abandoned years ago. Safia didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving Eliza's. "I'm not trying to fill anything," she said, her voice calm and steady. "And I don't see a vacancy. I see a man. A good one." She slid her hand into Marcus's, lacing her fingers through his. "We should get going. The horses need to be fed." She didn't wait for a reply. She simply turned, pulling Marcus gently with her, leading him away from the ghost that had haunted him for so long. He followed, dazed. He had braced for the old pain, the familiar humiliation, but it hadn't come. All he had felt was a cold anger at her disrespect toward Safia, and an overwhelming, powerful surge of pride for the woman walking beside him. As they drove away, he looked over at Safia. Her jaw was set, but her hand was still resting on his leg, a solid, reassuring weight. "You okay?" she asked softly. He thought about it, really thought about it. The encounter hadn't shattered him. It hadn't even shaken him. It had simply clarified things. "Yeah," he said, and he meant it. "I am." He realized then that Safia hadn't just helped him tear down his walls. She had helped him lay a new foundation, one built not on the fear of past pain, but on the hope of a future built together. The ghost had finally been laid to rest, not with the fight, but with the quiet, unshakable strength of a love that was real. And in its place, something new was being built, something that could withstand any storm. Spring did not simply arrive in Texas that year. It erupted. A riot of bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush carpeted the meadows, transforming the land from a canvas of muted browns and grays into a breathtaking tapestry of vibrant color. It was a resurrection, and Marcus Stone felt it echoing within his own soul. The long, frozen winter of his heart was over. Life on the ranch settled into a new, profound rhythm, one built not on solitude, but on partnership. Safia's presence was no longer an interruption, but the very pulse of the place. The old house, once an echo chamber of loneliness, now breathed with life. The scent of her coffee mingled with his in the morning. Her veterinary journals lay stacked beside his farm ledgers, and her laughter, a sound he once thought the walls had forgotten, filled the rooms. He was learning the grammar of love again. It was in the way he'd automatically check her tire pressure before a long drive, the way she'd leave a note on the fridge if she had an early call. It was in the silent communication of a shared glance, across a crowded room, a language only the two of them understood. He found himself speaking more, not just to her, but to his hands, to his friends. The permanent furrow of worry between his brows began to soften. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the fireflies ignite like tiny stars in the gathering dusk, Safia leaned her head against his shoulder. "The McCullens are selling their south pasture," she said softly. "The one that borders your land. It's going up for auction next month." Marcus stilled. The McCullen pasture was prime grazing land, the key to expanding his herd, sustainably. It was a dream he'd let die years ago, filed away under impossible. "It's a big investment," he said, the old cautious part of him rising. "A risk." Safia lifted her head, her eyes searching his in the twilight. "Is it? Or is it the next logical step for this ranch? For your future?" She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Our future. Our future." The two words sent a jolt through him, not of fear, but of thrilling, terrifying possibility. He looked out at his land, but for the first time, he didn't just see what was. He saw what could be. A legacy, not of one wounded man, but of a family. He saw a bigger herd, a new barn, a future where a child might one day learn to ride in those very fields. "You think we should do it?" he asked, his voice hushed. "I think," she said, taking his work-roughened hand in both of hers, "that you stopped dreaming a long time ago. And I'll think it's time you started again." The decision was made in that moment. The auction became their shared mission. They pored over finances late into the night, their heads bent together under the warm glow of the kitchen light. He drove her out to the pasture, and she walked the fence line with him, pointing out the quality of the grass, the access to water, her practical, knowledgeable mind perfectly complementing his own. They were a team. The day of the auction was bright and cloudless. The town hall was packed, a sea of familiar faces and Stetsons. Marcus felt a familiar tension coiling in his gut, the old instinct to shrink from the spotlight. But then he felt Safia's hand slip into his, her grip firm and sure. She stood beside him, a quiet pillar of strength, her belief in him a tangible force. The bidding started fast. He met each raise with a steady nod, his voice firm. But then a challenger emerged from the crowd, a wealthy land developer from Austin, his eyes sharp with calculation, seeing not a legacy but a potential subdivision. The numbers climbed, pushing past the comfortable limit Marcus had set. The developer's bids came quick and arrogant, designed to intimidate. Doubt, cold and familiar, began to creep in. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, waiting for him to fold. He glanced at Safia. She didn't look at the developer. She looked only at Marcus. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes saying everything her voice couldn't. "This is yours. Believe it." The auctioneer's voice was a rapid-fire drum roll. "I have 42,000. Do I hear 42.5? Going once?" Marcus took a sharp breath. This was more than a land bid. It was a bid on the man he had become. It was a declaration that he was no longer defined by loss, but driven by hope. 43, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the tension, louder and clearer than he expected. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The developer scowled, whispered to his assistant, and then, to Marcus's shock, shook his head. "Sold." To Marcus. "Stone." The gavel cracked down, the sound final and triumphant. A wave of applause broke out. Jake whooped and clapped him on the back so hard he stumbled. But Marcus only had eyes for Safia. She was beaming, her face alight with a pride so fierce it stole his breath. He pulled her into a hug, lifting her off her feet, the joy inside him so immense it felt like it could light up the entire state. "Welcome to the family," he whispered into her hair, and he felt her laugh against his chest, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. That night, they celebrated with Jake and a few close friends at the ranch. There was food, music, and laughter that echoed under the vast starry sky. It was a party the old house hadn't seen in a generation. Marcus moved through the crowd, his hand never straying far from Safia's, his heart so full he thought it might burst. Later, when the last guest had departed and the silence was a comfortable, shared one. They stood on the porch, looking out at the newly acquired land glowing silver in the moonlight. "It's really oursy," he said, the wonder still fresh in his voice. "It always was," she replied softly. "You just had to be brave enough to claim it." He turned to her then, the moment stretching, perfect and still. The air was sweet with the scent of rain-dampened earth and night-blooming jasmine. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the small velvet box that had felt both like a weight and a promise for weeks. "Safia," he began, his voice thick with emotion. All the carefully rehearsed words vanished from his mind, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth. "You walked into my life when I was just a shadow of a man. You saw the light in me when I could only see the dark. You taught me how to hope again." He dropped to one knee, opening the box to reveal a simple, elegant diamond that caught the starlight. "My life didn't truly begin until you were in it. Will you build that future with me? Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, but her smile was the sun itself. She cupped his face in her hands, her touch as gentle as it was sure. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. "1,000 times, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, and as he stood to kiss her, he knew this was the true harvest. Not the land, not the cattle, but this profound, hard-won peace, this love. It was the crop sown in the broken soil of his past, patiently tended through the storms of his fear, and now, finally, gloriously reaped. The wedding was 6 months later, not in a church, but under the ancient oak tree in the middle of their ranch. The entire town came, a testament to the man who had come back to them. When Marcos saw Safia walking toward him, not in a white gown, but in a simple, elegant dress the color of cream, her dark hair crowned with bluebonnets, he felt a peace so deep it was almost holy. He held her hands as they said their vows, his gaze never leaving hers. He was no longer Marcus Stone, the betrayed. He was Marcus Stone, the redeemed, the loved, the whole. As the sun set, painting the sky in a final, spectacular blaze of orange and purple, he held his wife in his arms. The past was a closed book. The future was an open field, ripe with possibility, waiting for the seeds they would plant together. The man of stone was gone. In his place stood a man of light, his heart once shattered, now pieced back together with a gold so strong, so brilliant, it would shine for the rest of his days. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the greatest adventure was just beginning.